Hi everyone. On the 26th of September 2022, Ben Gilroy released a video on his Facebook channel advising that Glenn Miller of Yellow Vests had been in court that day charged with organising a protest during the COVID-19 lockdowns and had in fact been found guilty of this alleged offence and was handed a 6-month sentence and a €500 fine. Following the release of this video, I could see there was a lot of speculation on social media as to whether Glenn had actually been prosecuted for organising a protest or for some other offence. And I expect this suspicion came in part from a disbelief that the guards, the DPP, the government and the courts could actually have gone so far as to declare protesting or the organisation of a protest to be an illegal act in a country where it is claimed that we are free. I met with Glenn last Saturday to go through the offences he has been charged with in order to resolve any speculation. So the point of this video is to eliminate any doubt that the courts have declared protesting during COVID-19 to be illegal and to ask you to understand that if they can find Glenn guilty of organising a protest, they can find anyone guilty. Although this video is in part about Glenn Miller, it is also about you, your right to protest and the dangerous precedent this prosecution sets, and how quickly your right to peaceful assembly can be taken away regardless of what side of the political spectrum you fall on. To put any doubt that may still remain to bed, let's take a look at some of the paperwork that has been served on Glenn. As I understand it, Glenn has 4 open summonses before the court, and they are all for organising or causing to be organised a relevant event. In Glenn's case, the relevant event in question is a protest. The 2 summonses on the screen are for events held on the 22nd of August and the 3rd of October 2020. Now, although Glenn has 4 current open summonses alleging that he organised protests on different dates, it has been suggested that the Gardaí intend to serve up to 21 separate summonses on him, all for organising different protests on different dates. The first comment I want to make is that I recall a lot of negative speculation around Glenn when these protests were being organised, with many people querying how these protests were able to go ahead and why the Gardaí were not intervening. In my opinion, the level of government overreach we have endured for the last 2.5 years has been a rehearsal for something more sinister in future. And with this in mind, I can understand why the Gardaí facilitated these protests. If the Gardaí or the government were genuinely concerned that SARS-CoV-2 would be spread outdoors by people attending a protest, these protests would not have been allowed to continue. But if the point of these prosecutions is to quell the appetite for protesting in general, whenever an absurd law is introduced declaring peaceful assembly to be illegal, then the only way to achieve that aim would be to make an example of somebody by, say, charging them with 21 separate offences, each potentially carrying a separate fine and prison sentence. This then would ensure that they never organise a protest again, and it would also act as a deterrent to others. I am also aware that Herman Kelly of the Freedom Party is being charged with organising a protest. One interesting point to note is that I myself organised a protest on the 17th of March 2021 during a level 5 lockdown, and I have not been charged with anything, and the reason for this is very clear to me. We currently have a legal case before the courts challenging the constitutionality of the COVID-19 laws, and one of the replies from the state is that I do not have the legal standing to take this case. This simply means that the state is arguing that I have not been sufficiently affected by the laws to allow me to take a case against them. So if the state were to charge me with organising a protest, this would mean that they could no longer argue that I do not have legal standing. In my opinion, the Gardaí, the government and the DPP are strategically deciding who to prosecute and which protests to facilitate to enable prosecution. In addition to the 2 summonses on the screen, I also have a copy of a book of evidence for another alleged offence of organising a protest, which is said to have occurred on the 12th of September 2020. Interestingly, this book of evidence makes specific reference to the offence of the alleged organisation of a protest in breach of the Health Act 1947, whereas the summonses we looked at earlier referred to the organisation of a relevant event. I'm going to extract a few noteworthy points from the book of evidence for your information. So the book of evidence states the following. 1. The protest was permitted to continue on the 12th of September 2020, and Gardaí facilitated the march's protest by engaging in traffic management and allowing free movement. This statement is very important, as at the time many people questioned why the Gardaí were facilitating these protests. As I said earlier in this video, the conclusion that I have drawn is that the Gardaí and the DPP intend to make an example of Yellow Vest by potentially serving 21 separate summonses on them, and in order to make this example, it was necessary to allow these protests to continue. 2. An Garda Síochána adopted a graduated policing response to ensure individuals complied with the government's temporary restrictions on movement as set out in the regulations by implementing the 4-step escalating principles of engage, explain, encourage and enforce. Garda members were directed to initially engage the voluntary compliance of individuals to the temporary restrictions of movement. Gardaí were then to directly inquire from individuals they met when performing high visibility beats, checkpoints and patrols. Members of An Garda Síochána were then to highlight to individuals the risk to public health and explain to them about the risks and the wider social factors. Members of An Garda Síochána were then advised to encourage compliance and emphasise the benefits to the healthcare services by staying at home and how this could save lives and reduce risk for more vulnerable people in society. Only when faced with non-compliance by individuals should members of An Garda Síochána enforce their Garda powers. This statement is very important for anybody who has been charged with an offence under any of the COVID-19 regulations, because these same principles would or should have been applied to every person before they were prosecuted for an offence. For example, at the end of this book of evidence, the sergeant actually recommends against the prosecution of Glenn on this occasion, as the sergeant was not comfortable that all 4 stages had been followed with respect to this protest. So anyone who has been charged with an offence under the COVID-19 regulations should carefully study the book of evidence in their case to see if they can pick holes and argue that all 4 stages of engage, explain, enforce and encourage have not been followed. The third issue I wanted to point out is the level of surveillance around these protests. The book of evidence discusses Gardaí watching open source media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram and YouTube, relevant websites such as the Yellow Vest website, being provided with photographic evidence from the Air Support Unit, also using CCTV from the Air Support Unit, and also using Garda camera CCTV. The book of evidence also confirms that at least 3 members of the Gardaí wore plain clothes and mingled with protesters throughout the event. 4. For any of these protests, the Gardaí carry out a threat assessment, and for the protest on the 12th of September 2020, the threat was deemed to be moderate to high risk, as there were fears of a counter-protest planned by the Antifa group. This itself is a clear acknowledgement that a peaceful protest was planned and that the only threat of violence came from the pro-establishment protesters of the left. In fact, the book of evidence goes on to state that there were no incidents of note reported by the Gardaí at this protest. Again, a further acknowledgement that the people who organised and attended this protest intended to exercise their constitutionally protected right to peaceful assembly. 5. Finally, the book of evidence concludes in recommending no prosecution in this case and states the following. In light of the recent advice on proofs under the regulation in the Health Act 1947, which outlines the necessary proofs required to sustain a prosecution, I do not believe a prosecution can be brought against Glenn Miller or X because on the 12th of September 2020, Glenn Miller and X were not clearly informed that they were in breach of the regulations and informed that if they did not comply with the regulations, they would be committing an offence under Section 31A as inserted into the Health Act 1947. And the penal penalties and consequences of such a failure was not explained to both of them. I recommend no prosecution in this case. To conclude, I hope this video resolves any doubt regarding the multiple charges Glenn Miller is facing and the price he is likely going to pay for exercising his rights. That said, I have no doubt that if Glenn could go back, he would do it all over again. Which brings me to my final point. Many of us are aware that we are entering a new era of state persecution, such that if you exercise political freedom in ways deemed offensive to the establishment, you may end up in a prison cell. I am reminded of Cathal Crowe TD standing tall in Dáil Éireann and arguing to introduce laws to criminalise political discussion by branding it hate speech. I am also reminded of Leo Varadkar being interviewed on News Talk, suggesting that one could practically lose everything for expressing nationalist views. Make no mistake, our future, the future of our children and their freedom, depends on your willingness to resist at high cost all unjust laws. Thanks for listening.